Hello, hello. I am so glad we have this time together. I'm Sanaa Laybourne. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from across the country who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. Go ahead and grab that cup of coffee and get ready for a fun and insightful conversation. In the last few years, loss and grief have become a shared collective experience, particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. This period has also put the inequities in the US healthcare system front and center, along with the ways that what has been quote unquote normal has often been harmful or unsustainable. So, how do we make sense of the loss of loved ones, especially when the systems that should take care of us fail us? How do we learn to take care of ourselves in a society that expects us to work hard at all times, leaving little room to properly grieve? And what type of new normal do we want our future to hold? Nicole Chung wrestles with these questions and more in her latest book, A Living Remedy. Nicole is the author of the national bestseller, All You Can Ever Know, named a best book of the year by over 20 outlets, including NPR, The Washington Post, and Time. All You Can Ever Know was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, the NABA Book of the Year, a semifinalist for the PEN Open Book Award, a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers selection, and an Indies Choice Honor Book. Nicole is currently a contributing writer at The Atlantic, a Time contributor, and a Slate columnist. Her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, Harper's Bazaar, Esquire, GQ, and Vulture. Born and raised in the Pacific Northwest, she now lives in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm so happy to have you here, Nicole. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I could not wait to read A Living Remedy. Of course, I have your first book, All You Can Ever Know, which was so groundbreaking for adoptees, right? To see our story and to be written in such a beautiful way. So thank you so much for that. And I knew once A Living Remedy was out that I had to have it. But this is very different than your first book.
It is. It is. It's much, I think it's broader in scope and in a way covers more of my life. And whereas All You Can Ever Know was very focused on, my search for my Korean birth family and what I discovered there. When I searched, this book is really more focused on my adoptive parents and me and that relationship, and what it's been like to grieve for them.
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many themes interwoven throughout this book. Of course, grief being, a key theme, but also community care and the structures of our society that are impacting how we experience the world. So, of course, healthcare and capitalism. But for me as a reader, what I really took away from this book, or what I thought was a particular gift that you've given us in this story, is you are writing this as you're in the early stages of your grieving process. The book itself feels very much in process. There isn't a tidy conclusion, right? It's messy, it's questioning, it's human. And I really love being brought into, a glimpse into your grieving process. But it also helped me think through my own grieving process. And I'll just be honest, I jump right in with tears. I was crying by the end of the third page. And so I think, making that human connection for me, I think that's just the hallmark of a really great writing, that you're able to connect with your reader and make us feel something.
Thank you very much. I mean, this book, another big difference, I think, between my first and my second is that the events in the first book, I was 5 or more years past my search and reunion when I wrote that book. And of course, as you know, adoption is something we're always figuring out. Our feelings and our thoughts about it are always shifting and evolving. But in terms of the actual events in that story, things were fairly settled.
Mhm.
And as you point out with A Living Remedy, I'm writing, in the throes of a very immediate grief. I didn't have like a 5 year buffer between, I
Yeah.
was working on it. I started writing it before my mother passed away in 2020 and then put it down for a while. But I did start writing again, 5, 6 months after she died, which is not that long.
Mhm.
And in that sense, it's very raw. And I was really striving for, emotional honesty, which I think is important in any kind of writing. But it was a new kind of challenge, and there were many points when I didn't know, honestly, if I'd be able to finish it.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And again, just thank you so much for writing this book. You mentioned, adoption and being an adoptee. It is a continual process, and we're constantly, learning new things or maybe thinking about things in a different way. And so for me, the book, I was reading it definitely through that lens as an adoptee. And so I kind of wrote, notes throughout the book. I'm like so in my adoptee feelings right now, but then also in the just those general feelings of grief and knowing what it's like to lose a parent and to kind of see a parent, like slowly die in front of you as well. I think so in thinking about your father and kind of that process that you talk about in the book, because it is about both the grieving process with your both parents, your mom and your dad.
It's true. I mean, something I've said about this book is every book is a process, that writing process, and it's different every time. And in this case, it's a process about a process because
Right.
grief is that's what grief is, and it's not linear. It's not it's different for everybody. And so, as many like grief stories as I've consumed over the years, and I guess particularly like in the last handful of years because of what I've been going through, I mean, everyone is just so different, because everyone's relationships are different, those experiences and losses. So yeah, on the one hand, I think it was sort of daunting to try to add to what's a very robust field of literature about
Hmm.
this subject. And on the other hand, I actually wasn't worried about, I don't know, having it feel original or wondering if I had something to say, and just because of the circumstances of when and how I lost both my parents, I knew there was a lot to work through,
Hmm.
and hopefully things that will help other people feel seen or less alone in their grief.
Hmm. Absolutely. I mean, what's coming to mind as you were just talking was in the book, you have this line that says, I'm an expert at grieving under capitalism. And I'm thinking about that because, as you mentioned, you're writing this book and you have kind of one way you're going to approach it. And then your mom passes, and then you're still writing kind of in this process of processing that loss, and also still kind of, as you talk about in the book, just doing life as normal, as if, I just have to meet this deadline or finish this pitch. And I'm wondering still too, because I also acknowledge that, much of the book tour is also was
Mhm.
happening and is happening as you're still grieving. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. It's kind of interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say it was like a throwaway line, the grieving under
Hmm.
capitalism, but I didn't know that it would resonate with people the way it has. But it's something that's come up in like nearly every interview. And
Hmm.
like, of course, there's a reason for that. It often feels as though, and one of the many, there's so many lies of capitalism, but one is just that we're constantly being asked or expected to deny our humanity and the
Hmm.
humanity of those around us. And it's a particularly difficult thing to do while grieving, um, because grief can be so all consuming. It's physical, it's emotional, it affects your psychological, mental state of mind. And at the same time, many of us in this country, especially like we work with no bereavement leave to speak of, or
Hmm.
no kind of paid leave or even guaranteed unpaid leave. And so often, not just after a loss, but leading up to it, when our loved ones are ill, like declining, my mother's in hospice, for example, or my father's very, very ill, there is no taking time off, even when trying to figure out elder care and managing my parents' affairs from afar was essentially like a second, almost full-time job at
Hmm.
certain points. I still had my actual full-time job to be doing, and the work of parenting never stops. And I'm also a freelancer, so it was just it often felt as though there was no chance to pause or to rest or to breathe or to treat myself like a human being.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember particularly in the days after my father died, that was my first major loss. I didn't know, I know there is no normal with grief, but I did not know what would be normal for me.
Hmm.
And I remember thinking, okay, like I will take a week off, maybe two, and then I'll be all right. I'll be able to at least go back to work. And I did, but it was incredibly hard.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know. I hadn't anticipated how that would feel. And I knew the healthier, better thing for me would be to take longer, to not just jump back into working and managing and editing and trying to promote a book or going on tour. And it was not an option really to
Hmm.
pull back on any of that unless I gave up my income, you know? I don't know. With my mother too, when she got sick and started hospice care, like I remember thinking, unpaid leave, like this would
Hmm.
be an amazing time to take family leave because I just wanted to be able to focus on her and the time we had left. Um, and there was no way to do that because I'm financially supporting her at that point.
Hmm.
So again, there's just the nonstop grind of what we are not just expected but like required to do for survival, I think, under capitalism. And it was distressing to realize on top of everything else, on top of like how difficult it was to grieve and all the time and energy that saps, like in addition to that, there was just so little space
Hmm.
to be a human being who was mourning.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking about those words, to the space to be a human being who is mourning, right? It's as though we have to keep going. We have to keep going. And it's not just a feeling that we have to keep
Right.
going, but as you mentioned, it's the material reality that if I actually take this time that I need, um, then the hand, not the payoff, but the handoff or trade-off is that I don't have money to pay bills, or, I literally cannot live, right?
Mhm.
I need to grieve in order to live, but I also need to continue to work in order to live in the capitalist society that we've created, because bills will continue to be due and I must pay them. And your book, of course, that is one of the main, points of the book, is talking about these systems that we're living under, capitalism, but also in particular the healthcare system, which you really talk a lot about in your book. And you make a lot of great connections between past healthcare systems, present, and just all the holes that we have in these systems that are supposed to take care of us. And I think for a lot of people, unless you've, experienced, either a loss or just someone needing a lot of support, you may not be aware of how incomplete our healthcare is.
It's true. I mean, I think I was always kind of aware growing up that, I didn't go to the doctor very often or the dentist. Like we frequently did not have like health insurance when I
Hmm.
was a kid. I think I went basically when I was sick or really sick or when I needed like vaccinations. Um, and I kind of thought that was normal, but I didn't think about it much. Even my parents, who are obviously decades older than me, when we were all younger and healthier, I don't think it was top of mind, right?
Hmm.
It wasn't until they began facing various medical crises and then having to meet those, sometimes needing expensive medications. My mother needed two surgeries when I was in high school. And, um, we met these crises uninsured. And as a kid, as a teenager, even, I'm not aware, right, of like, I don't know, medical debt and the results for my family, but I saw the effects, right? I saw that suddenly, we'd always kind of scraped by and suddenly there was just like not enough. And I knew, by later in high school, okay, I'm working this part-time job after school, and that's what's paying for a lot of my basic needs.
Hmm.
Not just like luxury items, but like clothes and shoes and school lunches and college application fees and all that. Um, I think like a lot of people, I learned about like money and like our class and kind of how my family was situated in the world, like not through what was explicitly told to me, but what I observed and then tried to figure out myself.
Hmm.
Um, and so, but I would say like even when there wasn't enough money until my parents started getting sick and having these different health emergencies, I don't think any of us were actually thinking too much about like the gaps in our
Hmm.
healthcare, right? And then but like my parents of course were living with like the financial reality, and my father in his 50s started to really decline. I mean, he had what we now know was renal failure as a result of untreated diabetes for many years. It was just really difficult for him to access the regular preventive care, the treatment, the medications that he needed. And so when he started feeling really, really sick, like my parents couldn't figure out what was wrong. He couldn't go to the doctor. They were both unemployed at that point. Dad was finally convinced to apply for like Social Security disability, and like so many Americans was denied.
Hmm.
Um, was too proud to appeal, and they were either ineligible for or just denied like every form of assistance. I remember helping them research, there's what about rental assistance? What about like, food? Like, and there was nothing they were really eligible for at their ages and without dependents in the home. So it
Hmm.
wasn't actually just the healthcare system, right? Which they were also denied Medicaid, like the Oregon Health Plan. But it wasn't just that failed them. I mean, there were so many places where they kind of just fell through the safety net, again, like so many people in this country do. Um, and so what had really always been like a danger, like looking back, we were always kind of living like on the ragged edge of
Hmm.
stability. That was a kind of stability, as I write, that was dependent on like absolutely everything going right.
Hmm.
I think that as my dad got sicker and my parents got older, and like the need for like elder care really like surfaced in my life, that's when we really had to begin to grapple with these failing structures and systems. um, and I don't know, it's such a common American story, right? But
Hmm.
when you're going through it, you can feel as though you're all alone. You feel like everything is on you, because in a sense it is. That's what we do. We leave people, individuals, families, communities, to try to meet these challenges without the resources and the support and the care that we need and deserve.
Hmm. As you mentioned, so many different systems intersecting and failing, right? Not just your family, but millions of families in the United States. And even though this is a very common experience, which I think COVID-19 has really brought to the forefront, right? Because it is happening to so many people so publicly at, the same
Mhm.
time. But we're taught to, as you talk about in the book, see it as an individual moral failure. You say this is a country that takes little responsibility for the health and well being of its citizens while urging us to blame each other and ourselves for our precarity under an exploitative system in which all but a small number of us stand to suffer or lose much. And I mean, I think that's what kind of keeps this system running, as terribly as it is, right? This belief that, oh, it's our responsibility. If we made better choices, if only we, took care of ourselves, ignoring the ways that the system is set up to not do what it says it's supposed to do.
Right.
And so then we do often find ourselves suffering alone, or not having the support, even just emotional support that we need, because we've internalized that, oh, it's something we've done as individuals.
Right. The idea that you can bootstrap your way out of poverty, or
Mhm.
that, part of your American dream is going to include like the care and the support and the stability that you've worked for. It's just, I don't know, with healthcare in particular, I think a lot about how it's just a matter of not getting what you pay for. Because, of course, uninsured people still have to try to access the healthcare system. People still like pay so much. We have one of the most expensive healthcare systems in the world. And yet, even insured people suffer or don't get the care they need or can't afford it or end up with staggering medical debt because of that. And it is set up so that you kind of blame yourself. I mean, I remember thinking, God, why didn't I plan better? Why didn't I like have more contingency plans? Why am I not ready to completely financially support my parents and provide like healthcare for them, in my early to mid 30s? Like, I don't know, I always imagined too that like I bought into this myth that if I worked hard enough, long enough, I'd be able to take care of them.
Mhm.
And maybe eventually that would have worked out, but we did not have enough time in the end,
Right.
because of when they got sick. Um, so that's, I mean, that is something I'll have to always live with. But for me, part of my grieving process has been trying to remind myself that I am actually not, I'm not responsible for these structural failings.
Mhm.
I think we do have obligations for each other, and we have love for each other. And what do we do in community and family? We try to take care of each other, even if like we're up against a lot. The odds are stacked against us, but I don't think we're to blame. When it's just not enough, because the system is very much rigged against so many of us. And
Mhm.
that's just reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that reminder, right? We can't have these individual solutions to social problems, right? Even though have often bought into this idea that we can, like you said, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and
Right.
achieve that American dream. But we do live in these systems that are created in a certain way where, we really can't win, and definitely not as individuals. You touched on this idea of community care, and that's something that I saw threaded throughout your book. And I loved how I saw, ideas of both community care, but also these different communities of belonging is also what I was reading into that book as well. And I loved how you talk about how your parents were really cared for by a religious community that they had become, a big part of in their community. Even though you weren't necessarily, part of that religious community,
Mhm.
you saw how important it was to them and all the ways that they really showed up. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more of these ideas of community care.
Sure. So, I mean, that is one of the bigger examples in the book is the religious community my parents were part of. They converted to Orthodox Christianity after I left home. So it's not a faith tradition that I shared with them. I was raised very Catholic. And so their parish was really small and very close knit. Um, and I remember first being aware of it, like on the periphery, when I would go on visits home. I didn't usually go to church with them. But it was just, I mean, I could tell it was a big part of their lives and that they'd
Mhm.
made many like very close friends through this group. I admit sometimes, like looking back, I was a little skeptical. I have reason to be somewhat skeptical, I think, of religious community.
Mhm.
I've been in some, I don't want to go into it, but I've been in some strange, toxic spaces before.
Mhm.
I remember living under that pressure for a while. Um, but with my parents, there was something about their faith in their community that didn't seem to make them feel as boxed in or like
Mhm.
small as mine had made me feel sometimes. Like for them, I think it was a real source um of freedom. They could be who they were and they felt respected and seen and nourished. When my father started really getting sick, I mean, I saw their community show up for them in so many ways. There was
Mhm.
a parishioner who was a general contractor. And when my dad was having mobility issues, he came to their mobile home and outfitted it like with ramps and railings and everything that he needed to be able to navigate the home safely, and just did it at cost,
Mhm.
just the cost of materials. Um, I don't know, people were always coming by bringing food and just like more than that, like company. I
Mhm.
think it's one of the things that you can face when you're caring for a sick loved one is isolation.
Absolutely.
I mean, in addition to the time and energy and expense and all of that, the stress, it can just feel as though you're alone. And I will say, like, I don't think my parents were ever really alone. Um, Even during the pandemic, when my mom was in hospice, because my mother started hospice care for cancer, right as like the first coronavirus cases were being reported in the US. Um, and it was obviously like wretched timing, not that there's any good timing for that,
Mhm.
but um, like I was really comforted that she still had like close friends, I mean, chosen family essentially visiting her masked and bringing her food and walking her dog, and just helping, like just sitting with her, making sure she was not alone while she was dying. I was especially grateful because the pandemic kept me from traveling across the country to be with her. At,
Mhm.
so I don't know, there were just so many ways. I mean, I'm not even remembering all of them, but I really saw this kind of love and care in action. And I was actually nervous writing about it because it's one of those things like I'm not inside
Mhm.
that community. I didn't want to be presumptuous, but I really felt, it was just important to acknowledge what they did for my parents. Even like I don't know, big things like I remember trying to talk with my mother about end of life care and like a will. She didn't have a will. She was really resisting creating one. And I don't know that I would have been able to get her to kind of talk about those things and make those decisions, if not for like her friends from church. Like they came and sat with us, and
Mhm.
there was something about their presence that just allowed her to go there, right? And to feel like she wasn't burdening me with all of it alone.
Yeah.
So I'm very, very thankful for that.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed reading that part or those parts throughout the book, particularly because, as you mentioned in the book, you're not a part of the religious community. You have some skepticism around certain parts about religious communities, but you saw how important it was to your mom and to your parents, and you're happy that they had, and you said in their new community, I believe they were seen and known, nurtured and valued in a way they hadn't been elsewhere. And I thought that was, just so important. Again, in thinking about how important social connections are and community, not just when we are going through, an illness or major illness or loss, but just for our general well-being as well. So I really enjoyed reading that. You also mentioned as you were talking, that those community members, those church members, you saw like love in action. And that was actually another theme that I picked up on, not just for the religious community, but also for as you were reflecting, kind of in your own story about the way that folks were really actively loving you and showing up for you as well. And I just found that so comforting. And, of course, this is a book about grieving, but the ways that people actively love us, not just in words, but really in their actions.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I'm not sure if this is what you're referring to, but because my mother died in the spring of 2020, I mean, we had to live stream her funeral. Like we were alone, we weren't seeing anybody, and it could have felt like so lonely. And I won't lie, there were times when I did feel that was really hard, but I wasn't alone. I had my family, my spouse, my kids. And then I had like a lot of friends and like chosen family reaching out at that time. So even though they couldn't travel to be with me, I think that my friends, especially, were really trying to make sure I knew that they were thinking of me, that they were holding me. Um, I guess one example, I can think of things like people obviously sent food and they sent flowers and they did those things that you do, but then like I was having so much anxiety around the phone. I could not answer it. I wrote about this a little bit, but for
Hmm.
like months, all my phone calls had been about my mom, about her dying. It was always bad news. I had cried so much on the phone that after she died, I found like every time the phone rang, like my heart rate would spike.
Hmm.
And so I couldn't really talk to people who were reaching out, trying to express concern and love. So a group of my friends like organized this like video condolences. They filmed themselves just talking about how they loved me and they were thinking of me. And I saw I mean it was I saw like them at home or like in their backyards or whatever.
Hmm.
Just like wherever they were also isolating, quarantining. Um and they sent them to me so I could watch them like whenever I wanted and not have like I guess the pressure of responding or
Hmm.
having to kind of be in conversation, which was really beyond me at that point. And I remember watching them just like over and over. It was just such a beautiful thing that they realized it was a way they could be there for me, even though I was not answering my phone.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know, like how kind of creative and also really wonderful. So I mean, I still get teary when I think about that, and I still
Hmm.
have those messages. It just meant a lot to me. So I don't really have like adoptive family left. They're all gone at this point. But I feel really lucky in my chosen family. And yeah, in my communities, near and far.
Hmm. That's so beautiful. I was also feeling like, oh, getting a little choked up when you mentioned that because how beautiful to know, right? Have that tangible evidence of how loved and supported you are. And I think also, for folks listening, like just knowing that, people sometimes, even though we want to express care and concern through, picking up the phone and calling someone, that can also be a little too much, right, for that person, and for thinking about other ways that we can show up for the people in our lives. So I think that's an important reminder. I'm thinking about, so many people, even within the last months, have lost loved ones. And me just thinking about, okay, how can I show up for them in a way that is actually helpful to them? And still I'm able to, love on them, but in a way that isn't going to feel like a burden to them. Right. So thank you so much for sharing that. Um, you mentioned about, and of course you talked about this in the book as well, about, losing, as you mentioned, not having any of your adoptive family left. And you talk about in the book how your favorite cousin, has a conversation with you asking, how are you feeling? And you say it's like being unadopted. Um, and as an adoptee, that I can think about what that could feel like, right? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you are feeling now.
Yeah, I mean that I will say that word, I was not trying to be like dramatic. It actually just came out and sort of
Mhm.
surprised me because I hadn't realized I was feeling that way. My cousin's like he's wonderful. We're like the same age. We've always been close. And when we were little, he didn't realize I was adopted, which is like really cute. Like
Mhm.
I still tease him about that, but like that was just not how he thought about me. And
Yeah.
we were young enough that it was like kind of adorable. It wasn't like this colorblind thing. It was
Right.
like it was sincere, like you're just my cousin and I just
Exactly.
love you. He's the like last person I think in that family that I'm, still close to, but like everyone else is gone. And I just remember feeling, especially because my dad, my maternal grandmother, and then my mother like passed away within 2 years of each other. And they
Mhm.
were like the three people who raised me
Yeah.
and the people who really like remembered my childhood. They're the ones who I would always be like, oh, remember when this happened? And like they always remembered.
Mhm.
There's nobody left like that for me. There's a lot of distance, geographical and emotional, in my
Mhm.
adoptive family, and not to dwell on it, but I've always been aware as a transracial adoptee, as the only adoptee in my adoptive family. Um, I was always kind of aware of like who really accepted me, right, and who didn't,
Mhm.
like who understood or accepted or respected my parents' choice to adopt me and who didn't. And
Mhm.
so all that to say, I actually have a pretty large extended family, and I'm not, you know, my parents and I were not in close contact with many of them.
Mhm.
So when I lost my parents and my grandmother, it felt like that was it. Like these threads that
Yeah.
tied me to this family have are gone. And like, what does it mean to be an adoptee still, and to very much have that part of what formed me, but to no longer have my adoptive parents or those adoptive family relationships, like they're all gone.
Mhm.
um, I probably wouldn't use the term unadopted now.
Mhm.
I don't think that's where I am. But in that moment, that really bleak moment, when I'm talking to my cousin and I'm losing my mother, like the
Yeah.
last person, like, I mean, it felt very emotionally true in that moment.
Mhm.
Um, for where I am now, I mean, the facts are still the facts. I've still lost those people and lost that family.
Mhm.
Um, but I know that the fact that my parents raised me, right, that still shaped so much of who I am.
Mhm.
I I still I still benefit from like that love and that care and
Mhm.
that support that they gave me. And I don't know, I guess I don't I don't actually feel less adopted. Um, but I am still learning like what it means to be an adoptee whose adoptive family is gone.
Mhm.
It is like, on the one hand, I think my grief is perhaps similar to what so many people who lose parents experience. And on the other hand, like I wrote in the book, my grieving, is really affected by the fact that I am an adoptee.
Mhm.
And that it's a reminder, right? It brings back like that original loss,
Yeah.
like the loss I don't remember, but still happened, of my first family, and those connections, which, although I'm in reunion, like, and very close to my sister, those connections can never really be fully recovered.
Mhm.
Um, the losses of adoption. So it definitely brought up, like, losing my adoptive parents definitely brought up, some of that adoption grief for me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I was reading the book, but even as you were talking now, so much of what you said, I'm like, yes, I could, I'm thinking through things as well, because even in my adoptive family, like my dad is really the only connection I have to extended family. So somewhat similarly, we have been, out of contact, or at least I've been out of contact with a lot of my extended family, and he's kind of been that link. But just different things are changing to where it very much feels um, like I could understand, like if and when my dad passed, I will feel very much as though I have no more connections to a lot of
Mhm.
my extended family. And so thinking through, what it's like to be, I've thought about it, because I'm not married, I don't have children, how it feels to be somewhat untethered to this world, right? Like you don't have these family connections that are supposed to be, in our society, just like the way that we're connected to people, or the way that we know that, where we belong. And so thinking through as an adoptee, how that shapes, these feelings of grief, or how we think about family as well. Something that you talk about in the book, and you mentioned now as well, is like those shared memories, right? Like there's no one that you can just say, oh, remember that time when, whatever happened. And you talk about in the book, like it would take too much explaining for me to share this memory, with your
Yeah.
family, right? Um, and I was thinking about that as well. Like, what all do we lose, right? A little bit a part of ourself, because we don't have someone who can recall that same, great memory or funny story.
You lose like a certain shorthand. I mean, that's really what you think
Mhm.
of it, or like a special language that
Yeah.
you share with people who've like known you forever. And I'm not trying to say I think like either biological or adoptive family is the only like legitimate family,
Right.
or the only way you can have that history or that those connections. I'm really lucky actually to have like old friends who've known me since like elementary, middle school. Like not
Mhm.
many, but like actually the people visiting me this week.
Mhm.
Um, like one of them, she's a dear friend that I've known since we were probably in like fifth grade. And so like, she remembers actually what I was like as a kid, or as a teen anyway. Um, but yeah, I've lost that ability to just like, I mean, with my grandmother, even when my grandmother's dementia was really advanced, there were certain memories of me and our time together, because she helped raise me, that she held on to.
Mhm.
um, she would say, "Oh, remember when we would like, go fishing or crabbing or walk on the beach? Like, remember that time we were out in the bay and like we like the boat floated away from like the island where we were clamming. There's like, remember the time you got lost and the Coast Guard had to like find you and like reunite us. I mean, there are all these things. I don't know, people who remember my grandmother's recipes and how they tasted and what our house looked like at Christmas time, and
Mhm.
like, I don't know, pets who are gone, like so many huge and like also trivial moments, right?
Yeah.
Where like, I don't know, a word or a sentence was enough to like make that memory live in somebody else. I mean, that's gone now.
Yeah.
Like I'm carrying all these things alone. And that can be, for me, one of the most overwhelming parts of grief, actually, is just even the people I'm closest to and love the most now, like my spouse, my children, my sister, Cindy, like, because our history is just shorter, because
Mhm.
they didn't know my parents nearly as well or get to spend as much time with them, like just trying to even explain any one of those moments would be so, I feel like it would just take so much time and I wouldn't be able to make it real. And I'm a writer. Like I'm supposed to know how to use words to bring these
Mhm.
moments to life, but it's just so hard, and that's been really difficult. And I don't have a positive spin like to
Mhm.
put on that. That's just hard. Like
Yeah.
it was hard while grieving, knowing nobody remembered my mom quite the way I did, and that
Yeah.
continues like to really hurt. Um,
Mhm.
it doesn't mean I can't share my grief with people or that I'm not supported and loved, but yeah, the reality is like the people I miss, there's nobody left in my life who really knew them, the way
Mhm.
I did.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking about that process of loss, and I remember I lost my mom when I was a child. But even as I've gotten older, sometimes that fear of like, am I forgetting her? right? Because for me, there's so much distance between when I knew her and how long she's been gone, but then also just the connections to people too, right?
Mhm.
Of, keeping those stories and keeping those memories alive. So as you mentioned, grief, it is a continual process and, you
Yeah.
know, who we are and how we are in the world as adoptees, also a continual process. And so it's hard, right? And there's different waves, as people talk about, waves of grief. Um, but I think, in you sharing in a living remedy, right? That process of grief as you were going through it in those early stages, I think it really is very helpful. I can say for me as a reader, was helpful in me even thinking through feelings that maybe am still processing, right? Or even ways that I need feelings that I didn't even know that I had. And again, I think that's a really key piece of good writing, helping us to think about things in a different way, or even truths that maybe we weren't aware of yet, or ready to fully acknowledge until we see that experience represented on the page.
Well, thank you. I mean, that means a lot to me. I'm truly honored that you or that anyone kind of spends time with the book. And I know it is like an intense read. Of course, I hope there are moments of joy and levity
Yeah.
and care and rest. I wanted it to be, I tried to build in places where like a reader could like pause and like breathe. Like the three lists that are in the book, those are kind of some
Yeah.
of those places. But I do know it's intense. I will say, like, I don't know. I think that I don't know. I'm hoping it can just be good company to people who've, like you're saying, you've known grief, and of course your grief is different than mine. But I mean, I hope it was good company to you in that. And I think there's just so much pressure, I think, in our society, our culture, to look away from like deep pain and loss.
Mm,
And like we've seen this during the pandemic as well, just how few opportunities there have been for collective grieving.
hmm.
Um, and I think there isn't enough acknowledgement in the world of like generational grief and what that
Yeah.
means. And so I think it's important that we not look away, but I know it's difficult. And I'm really honored when people tell me that reading the book has helped them think about their own losses, their own experiences, people they've loved, because I think that's what memoir as a genre um, can do. And that's kind of why I love it, is like the point is actually not to like regale you with with my life story or some version of it. Even it's like I always want readers to be able to kind of meet themselves too, and to be
Hmm.
able to think about like what's happened to you. And
Hmm.
so yeah, that's like really meaningful to hear that it did that for you.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, a good companion, right? And that's what the book felt like. It felt like being seen in a way and being understood. Like I mentioned, so many points in the book, I'm like writing little notes and I'm like, exclamation points and, just talking back, like having this conversation, right, with the written text, because of the way that I see myself and similar threads, right, throughout the book. Something you mentioned that kind of piqued my interest and I wanted to talk about more. You talked about this idea of rest and even incorporating some places in the book, or being intentional about hopefully incorporating places where the reader might take a pause and take a break. Throughout the book, you do talk about, or towards the end of the book anyway, you talk about this idea of needing to take a break, but also feeling guilty for taking a break, and trying and learning to, try to listen to your body and resting and saying no, which I absolutely love, saying no. I'm wondering, how are you feeling now with your relationship to taking those needed breaks and just saying no?
Oh my gosh. I mean, learning to say no to things it's an ongoing learning process, because I mean, it's still sometimes really difficult for me. And
Yeah.
like if I think people will be disappointed, or if I can't do a favor for somebody, even if I don't know them, that's really hard. I've had to just like try to prioritize and do my best. Um, I got the idea from my friend Jasmine Guillory, who's a wonderful romance writer, but she has like a decision matrix, basically like a
Mm,
series of questions she asks herself to try to make decisions. And I've adopted and adapted that for
mhm,
myself. Just like whenever I get a new ask, I have these different strategies of like really thinking it through. Um, And I don't know, but it's hard. And taking time to rest is still hard. I no longer have a full-time editing job, which I worked for many years and which I loved, truly loved, and
Mhm.
also found it like impossible to write this book while
Uh-huh.
doing that. So I left that position while I was working on a living remedy, and I'm right now a full-time freelancer, which was supposed to give me more flexibility, more time in my schedule, like more time for writing, and not just
Mhm.
writing, but like the thinking and the creative
Yeah.
brainstorming and the space and the rest that
Mhm.
you, or at least I, as a writer, need to be able to come up with ideas at all. And it hasn't quite worked out that way because of book tour, but I am like eager to see in the next year or so, as things settle down, is this like a lifestyle that's more conducive to
Mhm.
creation. And I also recognize what a great privilege it is, to have been able to make that choice. That said, I'm still like hustling. You have to hustle to make any kind of living as a freelancer.
Mhm.
Having not ever done it full time before, I yeah, didn't realize. I knew it was a lot of work, but like I work a lot of weekends. Like, why? And I'm just like, why am I doing this when the whole point was to like have things settle a bit? I guess the difference is that my schedule is flexible, right?
Mhm.
So I do work some weekends, but I'm not working 8 to 10 hour, 12-hour days every day of the week anymore. Um, and I am trying to consciously build space into my life to be able to work on longer projects, to be able to think about, potentially other books. Um, but yeah, I don't feel I've reached any kind of like equilibrium yet. It's just an ongoing process, and I'm frequently reminded as a parent that even if
Mhm.
I have my work life balance in order, of course, like just the real and legitimate needs of children and dog will constantly like require, my attention elsewhere.
Mhm.
So that's just kind of the reality. But yeah, I do feel really lucky to have been able to kind of decide to be freelance for this time, and it may not last. I may be looking for other staff positions, but right now, especially with a book to promote and lots of travel, it's
Mhm.
been really helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I think I see this as you talked about this in the book, right? Changing this kind of like orientation, creating a new relationship with yourself. I see this as part of that process of like questioning some of the lies of capitalism, right? That we've
Yeah.
internalized. And of course, for sure, it's not just, individual changes that need to be made, but also systemic changes. But I always get excited when I hear people talking about, well, actually, I'm going to question my need to say yes to everything
Right.
or, this belief of I have to say yes all the time or else I'm going to miss out on something.
Or like being a people pleaser. I have to
Yes.
say, I didn't really think of myself as a people pleaser until I realized how hard it was to say no to things. Why? Because I don't want to disappoint people. Like, yes, sometimes there's a good reason to do it. It's an opportunity. Sometimes it's paid, or
Mhm.
sometimes it's just like, again, like a favor you really want to do for someone. But you cannot say yes to everything, right? It's just not
Right.
possible. And I think in addition to kind of reevaluating my relationship to like work and hustle, I had to really change my relationship to writing itself. Um,
Mm-hmm.
like in order to finish this book, I had to build more rest and more care and more intentionality, um, and more patience into my writing process, because I think with my first book and with almost everything I've ever done, as a freelancer, it's
Mm-hmm.
been very much about like it's work I enjoyed, but it's been very much about like buckling down and knuckling through. And
Mm.
if I had needs, like frequently ignoring them. And if I
Yeah.
was tired, like ignoring that too. And this book, I think because of the subject matter and the emotional terrain, I couldn't really just force myself, to like to write for 10 hours straight or
Mhm.
to hit a deadline like no matter what. I just needed more time and more space, and I had to be a lot more patient with myself. It's the first thing I've written that demanded so much of me, but also required me to show myself grace.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's why ultimately it's the book it is. It's not a perfect book, but I do think it's the best thing I've ever written. And I think there's an emotional honesty there and a sense of freedom I actually felt while writing that, I don't know, I haven't felt with other work. And so I'm
Mhm.
really grateful for that. But it was only possible because I really changed like who I was as a writer.
Mhm. Yeah. I know you've mentioned saying, before that writing this book and taking this different approach and being forced really to take breaks and really think through what you're writing in a different way than other works. You said learned to trust yourself in a new way, or like you just mentioned, that freedom and focus that you hadn't felt when writing, other pieces. And I'm wondering, how much of that are processes that you can incorporate into future work and how much of it really is because of the subject matter, right? And it might not really be something that you can replicate in other writings.
Yeah, so I think in terms of longer projects, it's definitely how I want to go forward.
Hmm.
Um, and like for instance, I'm trying to not put a ton of pressure on myself to figure out like what the next like solo book is. I have an anthology I've co-edited that's out later this year, but after that, like I'm not really sure what the next project is, and I'm okay with that actually. I'm trying to be patient and just kind of give myself the time. And I recognize too, like I don't know, many writers can write and focus on a new thing on book tour, and I do not have that ability.
Uh-huh.
So I'll need to be home and settled for a bit before I can focus on the next thing. Um, there was a time when that really would have bothered me, and I'm very much okay with it right now. A longer project, you have the time, the runway, and the like, I think space to you can kind of take it slow if you want to until
Mhm.
you start inviting other people like your agent and your editor and whoever else into the process. It's yours. It's a very private, project.
Mhm.
And you can take the time you want to take with it, honestly. I think it's harder to do right with work on deadline, like closer, shorter deadlines. I have a weekly advice column that just has to get done.
Mhm.
And when I find myself working on the weekend, often that's it. I take on freelance assignments, and those two have deadlines that are not really movable. So with shorter work, I mean, it tends to be like I'll take it on, I'll focus on it, and it's kind of a burst of work, and then it's done, and I'm on to the next thing. Um, but I do think that I will be trying to like work and write with a lot more intention and hopefully freedom and slowness and care, for longer works or longer projects that give me that luxury.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that different orientation towards the work. And you mentioned you do have another book coming out. It is an edited anthology, When We Become Ours. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that anthology.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. So it's a young adult anthology. It's co-edited by my fellow transracial adoptee, Shannon Gibney, who's amazing. It's
Mhm.
out with Harper Teen this October, late October. It's my first book in the like for young people. I hope it's not my last. I would really love to write more literature for young people. But with this anthology, I'm primarily an editor. I did write a short story for it, but every story is by a transracial adoptee. And it's just been like a really interesting experience. First of all, like it's been nice to be editing again.
Mhm.
By the time we really started reading submissions and editing, I was no longer a full-time editor, and I've missed it. So it was
Mm.
great to get to do that work with writers, and also to collaborate with Shannon, who's
Yeah.
wonderful. I think like we hope that it will be, of course, no one anthology can be like the be all end all in this area, but there is a real dearth of literature for young people by and for like centering adoptees.
Mhm.
Um, and so this collection is just kind of aimed at trying to change that. And we hope it's the first of many. So it's been really exciting to work with the different authors, some emerging, some established, many. This is their first story for in YA.
Mhm.
So it's been really cool. So we're excited about it.
Yeah, I'm super excited. First, the cover is absolutely beautiful. I
It's a
mean,
stunner. Yeah.
I mean, that alone, I mean, so gorgeous. And then, as you mentioned, just the importance of having adoptee stories written by adoptees. And what I really love is just thinking about all the folks who are part of the anthology, like you mentioned, some established writers, some emerging writers. So I think it also gives a good range of perspectives and approaches changes to the work. So I'm super excited about that. I mean, I can't wait. So I'm very excited to see this out because as you mentioned, where are the books for young folks? And I can think about for me when I was, growing up, how I wish that there would have been, an anthology like this one or even books like yours and Shannon's, right? When I was growing up. So such important work and I cannot wait.
Thank you. Yeah, we're excited.
Yes. Well, Nicole, it has been such a pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
No, thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks again to Nicole Chung. Her book is A Living Remedy. As I mentioned as we started our conversation, there are so many themes interwoven throughout this book. Of course, grief and the failures of our healthcare system are very central to the book because she's talking about the loss of both her father and mother. But also throughout the book, I see these themes of belonging and community care. And also as an adoptee, these feelings of family and understanding who we are as adoptees and our relationships to our family. And again, that layer of belonging and these ideas of where we belong and feelings of belonging. And so I very much enjoyed reading this book. Yes, it can be a very heavy topic. And I understand that a lot of us are experiencing grief and going at different phases of that grieving process. But I can't say enough about how much I appreciated Nicole sharing this book at the time that she did, while she's also very much in the early stages of grief. And I think that it will be a comfort to folks who are also experiencing those early stages of grieving as well. Again, that book is A Living Remedy. For today's positive note, I want to leave you with this quote from Orson Scott Card, the author of Shadow of the Giant. And it says, "Life is full of grief to exactly the degree we allow ourselves to love other people." I think that is a beautiful reminder about the role of grief and how deeply we feel certain losses. And it is very much tied to how much we love other people. You've been listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR. I'm Sana and I'm here every week. Make sure that you're subscribed to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format so you never miss a conversation. And if you're anything like me, there are points in our talk with Nicole where I gotta go back and listen to that. And if you're subscribed in podcast format, you can do just that. And of course, you can also share it with a friend. I can't wait to be back with you next week.